So and the only one who read the whole thing then. Okay, well,
Yeah.
you know what? That's impressive. Again, I mean, after page 75, I was significantly stupider than I had begun reading than I did at the start.
I think
I share your same sentiments because, like, I think it got to, like, as soon as they started talking about, because they started talking about finances for like the last half of the whole autopsy, and it was just, I felt like they were kind of distracting from what the main point was. It's just like, oh, well, what's it called again? Republicans raised more in this state, but we raised more in this state, but we didn't do it that well. It's like, I think the whole thing was just very distracting from what they're trying to do. Um, just going briefly on like a rant though about the whole autopsy. The whole thing just feels like it was designed to offend as little people as possible, and in the process, it ended up offending everyone because it has no content, it has no substance. It stinks, frankly. I think like, I'm gonna make a bold claim, and I think I could have written a better autopsy, and I'm not even a Democrat. Like, I'm not even a Democrat, and I could have ran a better autopsy than that. It just like all of the main reasons people were looking for a while, like such as like the primary issue. And I know I was looking at recent articles right before we hopped on, and there was stuff about the whole Israel Gaza thing was a big issue for the Harris campaign, and that did sink her numbers with a lot of like younger progressive voters. No mention of Gaza, Israel once, no mention of like the primaries once. It's just a complete disaster, honestly. Yeah, after page 72, you really didn't miss anything. I'm gonna be honest, I wasted my
Fair
time.
enough. Well, you know what? I mean, I had to stop reading. Like, it was an assault on every brain cell that I had. I had to stop reading it. I mean, first of all, the font alone, like in an official document, like the font alone was was excruciating to endure. The only thing in this document that helps you retain sanity was the person who was editing it, who inserts their snarky comments every few paragraphs. That's the only thing that can like allow you to retain a modicum of sanity. Like, I can only imagine that was
For
going through that
sure.
person's head as they're reading it. It's like none of this makes sense. Like, I mean, I've graded so many papers in my life. Like, you eventually reach that point where you're sarcastically grading just for your own sanity, and like that's what this person was doing. Whoever commented on it.
I think that the thing that shocked me most, and for the record, I got through page 63 of the Democratic Autopsy, and then I called it. The thing that surprised me was how common sense the reforms that are being suggested are. Because through that document, and granted, I didn't get into the financial section. I also quit for my own sanity. But through that initial section, the author was proposing that the Democratic Party needs to prioritize strengthening local parties and state parties, needs to prioritize running up their margins even in areas where they're going to lose, having a media apparatus that functions in at all times and not just in election years. And these are such common sense ideas for the Democratic Party that we have talked about them previously on this podcast. Listeners, if you go back to the episode that Rob and I did about the future of the Democratic Party, we discussed all of these ideas in that episode. And what I find dispiriting is they've released this document, and you know that there is a 0% chance that the Democratic Party is going to adopt any of these ideas, and the inexpert and unprofessional manner in which they proposed means that they will not be followed through. And so I was really, for reasons apart from the style and the use of language, I was really dispirited and disheartened by this
Yeah,
document.
I can see why, Jack. I mean, the thing is that you're right. There's a lot of the stuff that is being suggested I mean, listen, it's being filtered through a democratic lens, which on the one hand means it's designed specifically to offend me, but that's beside the point. And I'm not even, I'm not even a Republican either. I'm not the audience, so they're not trying to convince me, so that's fine. But yeah, like a lot of it's designed to be read by Democrats, designed to provoke a little bit, be a little insensitive in places, but generally to make Democrats feel good about themselves so that they might like adopt it. But you're right, the unprofessional, inexpert way that it's presented gives the opponents of this within the Democratic Party every opportunity to destroy it and damn all of its considerations.
The other part that I found to be shocking and disturbing was a document like this should offend people. After an election cycle in which you lost, certain people have to be offended, the people who lost you that election. And yet this document went out of its way to offend nobody. I was talking about this with Rob to the point about emphasizing funding state and local Democratic parties in all areas, not just competitive areas, but even in very Republican parts of the country. The document says that we must compete everywhere. We must fund organizational infrastructure everywhere. Now, if you know your history of the Democratic Party, you know that this became a problem during the Obama administration because President Obama, when he was in charge or his allies were in charge of the DNC, pulled that funding from Republican areas and shifted it to competitive areas. And so, if your argument is that this shift was wrong and that actually money should be redistributed to building organizational apparatus in even Republican areas, then your quibble is with Barack Obama. You are criticizing Barack Obama. However, every mention in that document of Barack Obama, I control F'd it, it was 9. Every mention of Barack Obama in that document was applauding Barack Obama. He's talking about the electoral juggernaut that is Barack Obama. You can't have it both ways. Either Barack Obama reallocated funding in a way that was detrimental to Democratic electoral performance, or Barack Obama is an electoral juggernaut who ought to be applauded and emulated. The utter lack of cohesion in the document being afraid of its own shadow, being afraid to piss anybody off, quite frankly, is ridiculous.
Yeah. Um, Andrew, you're not a Democrat. Let's get your perspective here. I know Jack's a Democrat, so he has more of skin in the game. Andrew, of the actual conclusions, if we can get past the absolutely, um, I mean, the fact that this read like a high school report, if it was done at a high school that was struggling to meet basic competency standards, um, what looking past its shortcomings, what were your thoughts on its actual conclusions?
I mean, looking past whatever that was, again, just I mean, echoing like Jack's sentiments, a lot of these like conclusions they come to are like they're common sense, but they're almost too broad, they're too basic. It's almost like, oh well, yeah, we should build up, the proper infrastructure to expand across the country. We should have one of the phrases they coined was always on, always late, whereas like the Democrat media strategy is always late, whereas the Republican media strategy is always on. And I did think that was actually very interesting because with organizations such as like TPUSA on the Republican side, which are very like they're always doing something. They're always doing like advocacy work, campaigning, petitioning, whatever, canvassing. And it does seem like, and correct me if I'm wrong at any time, because I'm not national politics isn't my focus, but it does seem like that the Republicans do have that over the Democrats. The Democrats seem to be much more focused on like during election season. Like I know a guy who worked on the Harris campaign, and he was talking about that campaign specifically was such a disaster because they really only started getting like signs and placards in like late September, early October-ish. And the fact that yeah, they do need to build up the infrastructure, especially in terms of media and the rapidly shifting like media ecosystem. I think that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump was able to win the presidency is the Republicans understood how media had changed. I think podcasts were very big. They played a very big part in helping to help him win. And the Democrats just did not have that strategy. I don't think. I don't think they had the same media strategy. They relied more so off of traditional media. Um, Besides that very basic conclusion, one comes to, I would actually like to raise the question, and it's something that came to me. It's almost like it's written so badly to where it's like, was this designed to? Because I was looking at the background of the guy who wrote this, Paul Revere. He's a controversial guy. He kind of just appeared out of nowhere. He was responsible for some debacle in the New York Senate back in 2012 or something. But it's like, I wonder if this was designed because no matter who wrote it, what I'm thinking is no matter who wrote it, someone's gonna go under. And so maybe they just chose the one guy who it's like, we can get rid of this guy. We could afford to lose him. So maybe this is some type, because it wouldn't make sense at all to choose this guy. So I'm thinking if they chose this guy, they just want him gone. But then you have the stuff with the DNC chair.
Ken
I
Martin.
forget his name's
Ken Martin.
Ken Martin. There's calls for him to resign, and I'm wondering, is there something against him too? Because it seems like the Democrat establishment, just across the line, across the base, it
It
seems
is,
to
yeah, and in fact,
and it's interesting to see how that power base, that power struggle will play out.
so
'Cause
here's
there's
one of the
something going
things
on
that,
there.
in fact, I wanted to talk with Jack about this. So we're gonna take this moment to do it because this juvenile Democratic autopsy is gonna give me a chance to talk about it. We are currently recording this on a Friday afternoon, starting at 3:30 PM, which means that we are working, whatever you wanna call this, at 3:30 PM on a Friday. You know who's not working 3:30 PM on a Friday? Democratic staffers. The Democratic staffers, I mean, we're working remotely here, but Democratic staffers work from home. They work a pretty short work week and they're unionized. And this has been a major problem that Ken Martin has faced, trying to motivate Democratic staffers to work longer hours and to work from the office. And he's facing stiff resistance from the staffers union. How can you expect to run a political party in 2026 when your staffers are unionized and they all work from home and they don't work Fridays?
One more question to that, Rob. How are you supposed to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters if nobody works at the Democratic
A good
National
point.
Committee headquarters?
A good point. But seriously, so there's been some Republicans who in the Trump era, crossed over to working with Democrats. And their biggest complaint about Democrats is the work ethic. They just can't seem to get them to focus and work weekends and work 80-hour weeks like the Republicans can. And it's like, so I say that because this has been a problem Ken Martin has had. Ken Martin's been trying to overcome this. He's been very public with it, that he's trying to overcome this. What you might call like a labor gap or a productivity gap between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And so I see something like this and I see the knives out for Ken Martin and I go, well, no wonder the knives are out for him. He wants them to work on Saturday, the occasional Saturday. And now during an election, of course, they work really, really hard. Everybody does during an election, but it's like, last November of 2025, other than in Virginia, New Jersey, who was working hard, right? And
I mean, that's kind of to be expected though. Like everyone's gonna work hard during an election season, but what's gonna separate the Democrats and the Republicans is the Republicans are willing to go the extra mile and be working 80 hours a week in even before midterms and just during that non-competitive season, and they're building up the infrastructure. The Democrats just aren't doing that. And I would additionally like to add the Republicans have a wider network to work with, even if let's say the RNC is incompetent, which I think that's a completely different conversation. But what's it called again? The Republican movement has different organizations that seem to work adjacent with the RNC, like TPUSA, the NRA, various pro-life organizations. The DNC, from what I've seen on the map, they're kind of gunning it alone. Sure, they may have some small allies in certain areas, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't seem to have these
I
other
would say they do.
national
They're
outreach organizations working out with them. They're too
they are
centralized.
centralized. They're nationally centralized, and that is a good criticism of the Democratic Party. And Jack, you probably have something to say about that. But I mean, the thing is that the Democrats have historically their kind of network has included NGOs and unions. The expectation is that unions do a lot of the are a big part of that. And I mean, in the Trump era, as Trump, especially with the traditional labor unions and not the service sector unions, right? Trump has done a good job of undermining the relationship between those traditional labor unions and the Democratic Party. And perhaps that could be as the Democratic Party has just shifted its not necessarily its ideology, although maybe that's part of it, but it where its presence on the ground. I mean, we should also be clear, like, the Democratic Party, the reason that the Republican Party has had to make so many adjustments as far as media goes is because the Democratic Party has been a media juggernaut from an ability to get their message out for a long time. I mean, look at Media Matters, right? They've had that infrastructure. And, on some level, maybe the Republicans benefited in 2024 from not having that infrastructure and having to kind of build something else up at a moment when things were changing so drastically. And so the Democrats, were not desperate. They're like, listen, we're really good at this. Why do we need to change? Meanwhile, the technology has changed, and I'll bring some Marshall McLuhan here for a moment. The medium is the message. As the mediums were changing, the message shifted, and the Democrats who'd been so successful using those old models, why would you change? The only reason to change is you get your door, is you get the doors blown off. But I mean, I think all of that, while I think all of that in this document is fine and maybe true, it seems like copium. The truth is that what nobody's willing to talk about in this document is what happened to Joe Biden. When nobody's willing to
They don't
Right.
address the
What
elephant in the
nobody's
room.
willing to talk about in this document is that Kamala Harris was a uniquely poorly situated candidate in 2024. Whatever her strengths are, whatever her weaknesses are, she was a terrible candidate in 2024 because she had that enormous baggage from 2019. Which was like the worst time in 2024, that cultural environment was the most hostile election to that moment in memory. I mean, I want Jack in now, sorry.
Yeah, no, there are a couple of points there that I want to add to. The first being that I mean, there's a degree to which the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, the state Democratic parties have never been altogether that good at their jobs. I mean, Will Rogers said, "I'm not part of an organized party, I'm a Democrat." That's because the Democratic Party organization wasn't that fantastic. Lee Simpson said, "We hate life and ourselves." That's because the Democrats weren't great at cohesive organization. And so I think that Rob makes a very good point when he says that the Democratic Party for a very long time has relied on labor unions. And as that, the both, I would argue, the institutional power of labor unions has diminished over time. And as labor union members have moved over to the right socially, and you see defections from the Teamsters, for instance, and Sean O'Brien's endorsement of President Trump, that has diminished. And so, to Andrew's point, there's absolutely an argument that the Democratic Party apparatus is too centralized in the DNC um, and in labor unions. And as those two organizations aren't doing that well, that naturally reduces. Other thing I would say is when you look at questions like funding and questions like media, the Democratic Party is sometimes too stuck in their ways and sometimes goes too far ahead. Where the Democratic Party, in terms of funding, has in many ways gotten rid of previous funding models, has, for ideological reasons, said we don't want to take corporate PAC money. And so they rely fundamentally on small dollar donations. But when you look at the funding imbalances between the RNC and the DNC, the RNC has tens of millions more dollars in their war chest than the DNC does. And I think that a part of that is that Republicans at large are willing to take corporate PAC money, and Democrats at large are more skeptical.
Sure.
If you're a corporation, who are you going to put your
Well,
money?
yeah, who spent
And
more in
so
2024?
I I mean, it's a complicated question because it depends on who you add in. Are you talking just the DNC versus RNC, or just the campaigns, or campaigns plus affiliated interest groups? Like I think that that question can be decisive because the answer to it really depends on who is on the different sides of that equation.
Okay.
Because you can expand and contract that list to make your
Okay.
argument.
Maybe. But the Democrats did not suffer for a lack of funding in 2024, right? Am I wrong here?
I mean, you can like even in the autopsy, they do say that, oh, it's good that, we have a lot of funding and we should utilize all the funding. And it should be a thing where if, a party asks for funding, we'll say, yes, it's not a problem of funding, it's a problem of where it's being allocated to. The Republicans had less to work with in 2024, I would argue personally, and we can get into specific numbers and stuff like that. I would argue they had less to work with, but they utilized it more effectively because they had less. They had less resources, so they had to force themselves to utilize these resources more effectively. The Democratic Party just squandered it, I think. They squandered a lot of money, which is why they're $3 million in debt now, and the Republican Party has, what, $67 million in cash reserves now? Those are some of the numbers that I've seen, but it's just,
I don't know if that's
again,
I don't know if that's the critical point, though. I think that
yeah,
the issue that the autopsy highlights, and what I feel is actually a fairly perceptive criticism of the Democratic Party, is that the amount of money that each party had in 2024 is in fact not the important thing. That the amount
yeah,
of money that you can spend in 2024, because at a certain point you have
Right.
diminishing returns. If you spend, $800 million versus $850 million, there's only so many voters in Waukegan, or pardon me, in Sheboygan, that you can persuade with those
yeah.
dollars. In fact, it's the amount of money that you have in 2023 and 2025 that matters, and in 2026 that matters. And inasmuch as the Democratic Party today has less money than the RNC today, the autopsy would argue, and I would tend to agree with the autopsy in arguing, that that diminishes your ability to lay the groundwork to a 2028 election. So you're not trying to build the airplane mid-flight.
Sure. And
But like the autopsy did highlight several, it did highlight several like good things that, yeah, they're great at doing fun at doing like like fundraisers and stuff like that. It's just again, I mean, Jack, I would actually perfectly agree with you. Getting that plane started mid-flight, you got you the Democrats would need to start earlier.
to me, what if I'm the Democrats, and I'm not a Democrat, but if I'm going to put my Democrat hat on here for a second, I would start by focusing on governing well where you govern and coming up with attractive policies. We're having, the autopsy, like every autopsy, really doesn't delve too much into policy. That's not necessarily its point. But in 2024, people were broadly dissatisfied with the governance of the Biden administration. Now, maybe you can't be satisfied with any administration in the 2020s. I mean, that's Jeremy Suri's argument in The Impossible Presidency, is that in the 21st century, governing's just too hard. And that there's no way to meet people's expectations. And so maybe Biden suffered from that. But I think people were broadly dissatisfied with the Biden administration. and um, they were broadly dissatisfied with Kamala Harris as a candidate. And it didn't help that Harris had to build the airplane as it was going down the runway because Biden didn't resign until the summer. There was no way around that. You didn't have primaries that anybody went through where they could build their team. Harris's campaign was in Wilmington. You know, something tells me Kamala Harris doesn't want her campaign HQ to be in Wilmington. Why is it in Wilmington? Because she inherited the Biden team. Right? So it was a difficult campaign scenario for Democrats. And so the emphasis on funding and was our messaging correct and all of that is interesting and worth discussing if you're a Democrat. But I think it just misses the point. They lost to Donald Trump again because they continue to only listen to the people they want to listen to.
I think optics was something that wasn't highlighted enough because I will play devil's advocate, and I think to a certain degree, maybe they could have won. Because the best example, what I keep going back to is, have there been because like anytime you're running a presidential campaign and you're the incumbent administration, you're always going to be kind of on the back pedal unless you're like FDR or something, but not most people aren't FDR. The prime example I would like to go back to is 2004. You know, Iraq War was going on. John Kerry actually seemed like a very attractive candidate for the Democrats, and there was a real chance he could have won. But then we saw that George Bush ended up taking not only the electoral college but the popular vote. And I think the reason that they were able to execute that despite all of the crazy stuff that was going on, like the Iraq War and stuff like that, is because of optics. They had they started swift voting. And to be fair, the Democrats have their own drama too with that one guy, Howard Dean, got removed out of the primaries. But the reason the Bush won was because of optics. And the Democrats didn't look at optics, I think. Well, I don't think they realized the position that they were in. It's a basic take,
True.
but optics is important. Like the Afghanistan war, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, sure, it was bad and it had, we did leave a lot of equipment there, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but that doesn't matter to the average voter. It's the optics that count. And that's something, even though it didn't really have much actual effect on Americans, that event itself just like symbolically, it just takes a lot of the credibility. And another additional thing too, before I wrap it up, is I think that the attempted assassination of Trump back in July, that created a sort of I think from that, and this is my personal opinion, but from that moment on, I don't think the Democrats had a shot because that just the Republicans exploited that moment to their fullest extent, and again, they utilized optics.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, the Afghanistan thing's a useful moment because the Biden administration never recovered from that popularity-wise. That was the moment, like, Biden was actually above water, in, popularity, and he fell below water in that, and he never got above water again. But anyway, Jack, I want you to jump in here. You're a resident Democrat, so
I I think that you're
good.
both wrong in a very kind and respectful way. And I'll address Rob's point first, that the Democrats listen to who the Democrats want to listen to, and that they're not listening to the people that they should be listening to. I don't think that matters because of the illustrative example of the Republican Party, where you have President Trump, who is currently embarked on a massively successful primary revenge tour of endorsing against and defeating any Republican who's shown even a modicum of dissatisfaction with the president. um, throwing them out of office to the detriment of the GOP's midterm chances. And so when you look at examples like in Texas, the Republicans are doing the exact same thing where they're not making the quote unquote smart or logical electoral choice. But is that ultimately the end of the world for Republican presidential hopes? No. We talk about the structural or the dysfunctionality of the Democratic Party because they're the party out of power. But many of those structural deficiencies are also present within the Republican Party, and the Republican Party won in 2024. And so I don't think that it's saying, the Democratic Party has a tendency to listen to who they want to listen to. Um, if the Republican Party does the same thing and they win, then I think it's got to be something else. And to Andrew's point about optics, while I do think it's true that the Democratic Party tends to misunderstand their or the attitude of Americans at large. I would argue that the Republican Party often does the same thing, gets out ahead of their skis and suffers as a result. Um, but I don't think that actually I am increasingly of the opinion that what the media says doesn't matter. That in fact what's on social media, on podcasts, what the campaigns are putting out doesn't matter. Because and I would revert to polarization. As polarization gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse in America, there are so many people in their online algorithms who are driven into their isolated silos and will never see an ad or an Instagram post or a tweet or whatever promoted by the other side. And so, as a Democrat, when Trump was shot, you're not going to be influenced by those optics. As a Republican, um, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. But we're driven into those silos, and so the optics of individual events matter less and less. And so I think that actually the only thing that matters in elections is the specific economic conditions of the 40,000 independent persuadable voters in the five most in the five swingiest states.
No, I
That's my
actually generally buy everything you just said. Here's why it's wrong, but it's correct. It's totally correct. Okay, Jack? It's totally correct
yeah.
based on the premise that winning is all I'm talking about. Okay?
Uh-huh.
In the autopsy, what they're talking about is the creation of a stable majority, right? Not one where you narrowly win by the skin of your teeth every 8 years, right? You win 50% of your elections by the skin of your teeth, which is what we currently have happening, right? In that environment, you're right. They can listen to the wrong people. The Republicans listen to the wrong people. And it's almost random if they're right or not at the end of the day, right? We're talking about the Democrats today because they happen to be randomly wrong in 2024, whereas it might have been randomly right in 2020, right? However,
I think that's
right?
a really
However,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's if the argument is, well, we listen to stupid people, the Republicans listen to stupid people, they're winning, so why are you criticizing them? It's like, I am criticizing them. 50.01% of the population doesn't winning that on one day every 4 years. 50.01% of the electoral votes does not mean you get to go home and claim. It means you get to claim victory, but it doesn't mean your work's over. It doesn't mean there's anything to celebrate there, right? The goal is to create a stable governing majority. And the Democrats have assumed wrongly since about 2000 that in 25 to 30 years they would have that by changing nothing because of their Rainbow Coalition thesis. And in 2024, the Rainbow Coalition thesis was proven to be wrong. And they have to deal with that. and they might win. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're going to win in November without major reforms across the board, just because people are broadly dissatisfied with Republicans. Binary choice, right? You're upset at Republicans, you vote you vote Democrat. You're upset at Democrats, you vote Republican. Among those small sliver of persuadable voters. But if you want to create a long-term, it doesn't have to be dominant, but if you're trying to create a party that's going to win 4 out of 5 elections, which you think the Democrats thought they were until 2024, and not just 4 out of 5 elections, but 4 out of 5 elections by real margins, where you've got an 80 vote majority in the House and where you have a 12 vote majority in the Senate, and you can actually do stuff, and you control several trifectas across the country, that party can't just say, well, the Republicans listen to the wrong people too.
There's an old joke that between two economists, where one economist is writing out economic forecasts for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and every paragraph starts with if economic trends continue, or if current economic trends continue. And the second economist gets the paper, reads it, and crosses out that first sentence of every paragraph and writes in if we never have a recession ever again. Because current trends never can continue indefinitely into perpetuity. And that, I agree with you, was why the Rainbow Coalition thesis was laughable and should have been laughed out of the room when it was written. However, I fundamentally don't think that the sort of permanent majority that you're talking about as the goal, and in an idealized world, it should be the
Both
goal.
parties is my point,
Uh,
not just for the Democrats. I think it should be the goal of both.
and I think I would prefer to live in a world where it was, is how I'm going to say that. But I think that as a political party, you have to win the next election. I mean, you as a political party can't sit back and say, well, we're not focusing on 2026 because really we're interested in 2028 and 2032. You can play the long game as long as you want, but there's an election in 2 years, and you have to go out and win that election. And so I think that damning the Democratic Party for not playing the long view in some ways also discounts the importance of the short term. And I agree with you, and the fact of the matter is, in that short term, because of polarization, that permanent majority is not possible. And so I would agree with you to an extent that both the Democratic and Republican Party should, in the back of their minds, be considering that long-term future. They also have an election to win in a year and in 3 years, or pardon me, and in 2 years. And in order to win those elections, these sort of critiques aren't, I think, the thing that's going to help them win in 2026.
I mean, yeah, but you can fundamentally reshape a party in like 6 months if you want to. Like, I don't think it takes 10 years to fundamentally reshape a party. I think it can be done pretty quickly.
Rob, would you argue that are parties reshape themselves, or that parties are reshaped by outside forces? Because I would argue that the political party, the DNC or the RNC, is not in fact the actor, but rather is acted upon by outside forces. The RNC, for example, was not the actor in reshaping the Republican Party in 2016. Instead, the RNC itself was changed when Donald Trump became the nominee because of underlying changes in the political
I think
environment.
Donald Trump changed it.
And so I would actually.
Donald Trump
What
changed
was that?
the Republican Party.
So actually, like the argument that we're having is immaterial because the RNC and the DNC aren't changing things anyway. They're going to be changed whichever way the wind
Well,
blows and the atmosphere
I think
shifts.
the RNC and the DNC are both capable of creating the conditions with which they can succeed in. They can attract the right candidate. They can actually shape the party in somebody's direction. I mean, if you look at the way that the DNC, I mean, we Andrew, you brought up FDR earlier. I mean, between 1928 and 1932, particularly between 30 and 32, the DNC worked really, really hard to be the sort of party that FDR could take into the 32 election, right? Organizationally, you cannot control everything, but you can create the conditions by which you attract the right leader, and with the right leader, you're able to win major majorities. I'm not going to sit here and say the leader doesn't matter. The leader absolutely matters in an election. A bad leader cannot be overcome by, or a bad candidate, all the it takes a lot of really good organization and really friendly territory to overcome a bad leader or a bad candidate. You've got to be, like, and even then, sometimes it's not enough. Like Roy Moore in Alabama when Doug Jones won.
On the other hand, the role of the RNC and the DNC does not extend to, in my opinion, shaping the underlying political forces, or the political atmosphere. In November of 2026, the Democrats are going to have a good election, the Republicans are going to have a bad election. Regardless, I would argue, of what either the RNC or the DNC do, simply because of the national environment. In 2016, the RNC, despite its condition as a bastion of establishment republicanism, uh, presided over a loss to those establishment figures and a win for insurgent populism, not because of anything they did, but rather because of underlying dynamics. You're absolutely right to say that the individual person who runs the RNC or the DNC is important for the day-to-day functioning or the organizational capacity of that organization. But fundamentally, that organization's direction, that organization's long-term effectiveness, and their ideological orientation is not determined by that person, and is not determined by that organizational capacity. It's the underlying political core. It's the underlying course of politics.
I mean, sorry, Andrew.
While I'd be tempted, I do want to agree with Jim. However, I think the current 2026 DNC is under this wave of criticism, this tsunami of criticism, and all these calls for the DNC chair to resign. And those are these political forces. I love to use the term the zeitgeist, kind of like the political zeitgeist at play here. But is the chair, is Ken Martin going to withstand the storm? I think if he resigns, Jack's theory will be vindicated. He'll be right. If he doesn't, I would argue that Rob would actually be right. But I would lean more towards Jack. The reason that the DNC was able to organize in 1930 and achieve a landslide victory in 1932 wasn't just because, oh, they decided to act. It was because the Great Depression, it changed the dynamic. It changed literally everything. It First of all, it made Herbert Hoover incredibly unpopular, and second of all, it forced the DNC's hand to actually reorganize if they wanted to, like, this is our shot. This is our shot to win. Um, Historical forces, I think at the end of the day, they help to determine. They're not the ultimate thing, because at the end of the day, it's whoever's in power. But they drive people to make the choices that they do. Whether Ken Martin, decides to drop down his chair, that remains to be seen. Probably. I would tend to agree with Jack, probably, because the pressure is so enormous, and we're already seeing this big divide between, again, the establishment Democrats and this more, what I would like to call, and I think Mamdani perfectly characterized the new Democrat, the 2020 Democrat, or like the 2026 Democrat. I don't know. I don't know a term, but this new um Democrat that's more willing to embrace just outright, just, democratic socialism, social democracy, whatever you want to term it, but a break from the old. And I think Jack will be vindicated. I think Ken Martins will stand down and the DNC will reform. But again, it all depends on what's the Trump administration going to do. Is there going to be another crazy thing that's going to happen? I mean, the aircraft carrier Nimitz has moved into the Caribbean, and it looks like the same thing that happened in Venezuela is going to happen in Cuba. Whatever happens, we don't even know, but history's going to force our hand.
Yeah, I mean, well, just quickly, historian of the Democratic Party in the 1920s and 1930s here. So, the Democratic Party, the DNC was moving in a very specific direction, and it wasn't the Great Depression, it was the absolute annihilation they took in the 1928 elections that really forced their hands. The Depression was fortuitous from a Democratic perspective, because it proved some of the things that they were already starting to say correct. And they were able to, guys like Jim Farley, were able to create an organization that FDR could, was the appropriate candidate for. And now he had to beat out Al Smith, who was running again in 32, but he managed to do so. But anyway, yeah, and Jack, I take both of your guys' points that, of course, historical. One of the things that you're trying to do, if you're a political organization, is that you obviously know that the forces of the world, what Machiavelli called fortuna, right, can destroy the best laid plans in a second, right? Like, let's be honest, right? Like, if for whatever reason the Trump administration, led by Consul Marcus Rubius, manages to uh, undermine, if the Cuban government collapses and a democratic government comes into place in Cuba that's very friendly to the United States, and however Iran shakes out, right? These could prove to be, that these are really good for the Republicans. Whether it turns out to be great in 2026 or not, it certainly could prove to be really great in 2028, right? And the Democrats have no control over that whatsoever, right? Because they're not in power. Jack said this way, got to win election. I hear you, and but and we've been talking mostly about the DNC because this is a DNC autopsy, but I mean, we're talking about leadership in the Democratic Party as well. And in the end, what we're seeing is a Democratic Party that is caught between two major factions. At least two major factions, Jack. We've talked about this before. You said there were four factions, Jack, before, right?
Yeah, there were four. Yeah,
Okay.
there were four.
How do you I didn't give you a chance to prep this, but where do you think we are with those four factions now?
I think that you're seeing a rise of dissatisfaction with all establishment factions, uh, not just and we talked about this on our last discussion together when we were discussing Graham Plattner and being an insurgent. I would argue that, in fact, the argument within the Democratic Party today is not necessarily like left versus center, but rather is in establishment versus insurgent. And that has sort of liberal versus populist connotations. But I would argue that it's I am a career politician versus I am not. And so that puts a different spin on it than the last time. I can't remember when we recorded
Yeah.
that podcast. Was that in like last November, something like that? Um, I think that that's definitely changed. What I would say, to build upon your point, the Democratic Party today works in a fundamentally different way than the Democratic Party in the 1930s did due to the McGovern reforms. um, after the 68 convention. And so the Democratic Party today is infinitely more responsive to the mood of the Democratic electorate than it was in 1930.
We should be
And
clear, there was
so
very little Democratic electorate in 1930 after the election of 1928.
yes. Yeah, the Democratic electorate in 1930 was, was named
It was
um,
called the South and Tammany Hall.
yeah, it was a big old elephant. Um, and so when you look at the Democratic Party today, Rob, you're absolutely right to say that the future of the Democratic or the future of the DNC will be dictated by that sort of by those four the battle between those four constituencies. And so I think that's a really perceptive question.
Thank you. I know. I'm very perceptive.
Yeah.
Um, the and the thing is that all these four factions that you talked about, particularly
Mhm.
the insurgent factions, are desperate to control the
Mhm.
DNC, right? Because it controls the resources, right? And we are this is another the civil war is going on between these two democratic factions, and what I think is of course hilarious is that there's a median democratic voter, but none of them seem particularly interested in the median American voter. And if the Republican Party was not paralyzed by its own paroxysms, there would be a huge open runway for it. And but there doesn't seem to be much interest in that either way because as you mentioned, Jack, I think both parties have sort of assumed like, well, Fortuna will figure this out for us. That like we're either gonna win by 0.2% or lose by 0.2%. And there's actually, we're gonna spend a whackload of money, but other than spending a whackload of money that we raise, we don't really know what we're doing.
What's your alternative, Rob?
My alternative is one of the two parties has to just recognize that that competence is the most important thing. And that these wild gyrations, which are a consequence of a whole bunch of different things, are miss the point or a distraction. Donald Trump managed to win in 2016 because he got a straight flush in the Midwest. He happened to pick up a straight flush on the river, right? In poker terms. He got lucky, right? He did enough to be in a position where he got like, and he happened to be lucky against an opponent who was pretty boring, but just didn't run who should have won that campaign. Hillary Clinton absolutely should have won that campaign if her campaign team wasn't incredibly arrogant, right? And if Donald Trump doesn't hit a straight flush on the river in 2016, like just because you happen to have 80,000 voters in 3 states that happen to be upset about immigration, right? People have interpreted those 80,000 votes against immigration to mean all sorts of manner of things. And that, like, basically, Trump got lucky in 2016. And in 2020, at the national level, the more stable campaign won. And in 2024, arguably the more stable campaign won. And like, if you look at the state levels, if you look at the generals at the state levels across the country, it's typically not the crazy or the more outlandish candidate that wins. They might win the primary, but they don't win the general. The candidate that generally wins the general is the more normie candidate. I mean, adjusted for partisan index. I mean, maybe it was just living in Georgia for the last several years. We can talk about Georgia in the next episode, but you know, why did Brian Kemp beat Stacey Abrams? Why did Brian Kemp beat Stacey Abrams in the same election that Raphael Warnock beat Herschel Walker by similar margins? Why? The more stable candidate won.
I think that you're using two definitions of stability simultaneously, and I'm interested in investigating that because I think that that would be instructive. There's the use of stability to refer to the candidate themselves, their competence for governing, and then there's also the stability of the campaign, whether the campaign is organizationally sound, has an effective um, it has an effective leadership team. And one of those things I would argue is important and one of those is not. I would agree with you that a stable campaign, having leadership that knows what it's doing, having a clear organizational, having a strategy and consistency is important. And you see that in to varying degrees throughout both presidential and state level politics. I would disagree with you that the capability or the consistency of the candidate themselves matters to a great deal. I would argue it matters on the margins, which is why you see examples like Matt Bevin or Chris Kobach losing. But fundamentally, it is not the decisive factor. Otherwise, Hillary Clinton would have won.
I mean, you can't,
Other
you know what? You can't overcome that degree of hubris on a campaign.
But but if the question, and I suppose there's also we're conflating right now stability in running your campaign and stability in
Mhm.
government. When you talk about who would be the more competent orchestrator of government, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, the answer is Hillary Clinton, if only because she's spent her life in government and generally knows what she's doing in a governance sense. Donald Trump is many things, and you can argue about the normative element of those things, but he's not a competent government administrator, which is why so many of the lawsuits against his administration's actions have succeeded because they haven't gone about them in a legally
You know,
correct way. And so I think that you have to, and so I agree with your argument, but I think you have to dissect that down to competence of campaign and competence of candidate, and then also competence in running a campaign and competence of.
well, I would say it's competence in running a campaign is what I'm talking about.
Okay. In that case,
Yeah, competence in running a campaign, and not just competence of leadership, but actually competence in running the campaign,
I
right?
would agree with that.
And you have,
I would agree with that. Oh, I would agree with that too. Yet it seems like there's a balancing effect where when the incumbent administration is stable, there's almost like a yearning for an opposite effect. That's why, again, the Obama administration was relatively stable, but Trump won. But then because the first Trump administration had a lot going on, Biden, the more moderate candidate, ended up winning, and then it's a weird balancing effect.
What a beautiful understatement. The first Trump administration, a lot.
well, yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. But here's the
Try to
thing.
keep it
The
nice.
first Trump administration, I think, in 2024, among independent voters, those same independent voters who voted for Biden in 2020, by the way, a lot of those independent voters remembered the first Trump administration not that unfondly. And however, I would argue the thing I mean, we can talk about that at a different time, what they fondly remembered of it. But, they voted. The problem is that Kamala Harris ran a bad campaign in 2024, right? And she was not an attractive enough candidate. Nobody thought she was particularly nobody thought Kamala Harris was particularly competent at governing. Nobody thought Kamala Harris was running a particularly good campaign in 2024. And she isn't interesting as a candidate. So she loses on all three, right? So we can't really isolate the variable when it comes to, we can't really control the variable when it comes to Kamala Harris, right? At least when it comes to Hillary Clinton, we can control the variable, right? Yeah. But again, I mean, I think we've read too much into the 2016 election. I think people have read too much into it. And in the end, there are struck by lightning elections. And 2016 was a struck by lightning election. And I mean, I don't blame the Democrats between 2016 and 2020 for not significantly reevaluating all of their underlying premises, because I don't think the facts of that election necessarily called for calling them all into question. I think it would, I think you could look at that election very fairly and say Trump caught a straight flush on the river. And you can blame that on the Clinton campaign, independent of the Democratic Party. You could blame it a little bit on Barack Obama. You could blame it a little bit on Hillary Clinton. I'm not saying there isn't blame to go around, right? You can blame John Podesta, right? You can blame, what was the woman's name who was Hillary Clinton's ride or die there in New York? Who was
Are you
Aberdeen?
Yeah. Well, and also Donna
Real, yeah, who didn't help either, right? Then a lot of you can look at that election and go, huh, a lot of stuff went wrong. We still won the popular vote. A lot of our, we made some mistakes, but our underlying strategy is not threatened here. And then they win in 2018 and pretty much a wave election. In 2020, they win back the presidency. There's a one-term president for the first time since George H.W. Bush. An incumbent loses. And then in 2022, they do pretty well. Right? And so at no point is there a need to reevaluate things. This is why this autopsy is so important, is because the 2024 election is the first time since 88 that the Democrats are really forced to reevaluate their entire theory of politics. And this is what emerges. You don't get an opportunity like this very often if you're a party. When FDR wins in 1932, part of the reason he wins is because the Democrats, after 1928, really investigate what happened. Why they keep losing, why they got obliterated in 2020, they come back a little bit in 22, they got obliterated, they really get obliterated in 24, right? Why they spend the 1920s getting shellacked everywhere outside of the South. And they come up with a strategy. Now, the Republicans help them, right? Hoover helps them. And it's not even Hoover, it's more Congress, the Republican caucus in Congress that helps them. But my point is that this is a once in a generation opportunity for the Democratic Party. When you get kicked to the wilderness, it's important. And both parties have been kicked to the wilderness in the last 15 years. The Republicans in 2012 and the Democrats in 2024. In 2024, at least I would argue, the Republicans had a theory of politics that extended beyond Trump. And they won. Now, whether that strategy holds up in 2026 and 2020, I don't know. The coalition seems to be falling apart. But, um, the Democrats, instead, what we're seeing is this major civil war between the two major wings of the party. And the populist insurgent wing just blames everything on Chuck Schumer. And the Chuck Schumer wing, for lack of a better word, has no answers for anything. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. The question that going forward, I think the Democratic Party needs to answer, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that an opportunity has been squandered, that an opportunity for soul searching has been squandered. The question going forward will be quite frankly, what is happening in the world come 2028? After the 2012 election and the autopsy the Republicans performed that you referred to, Rob, that autopsy said in order to attract Latino voters, we need to adopt a more conciliatory stance on immigration. Well, that didn't happen, to put it lightly.
But
So
they still managed to
going
attract
forward,
more Latino voters in 2024.
they still managed to attract more Latino voters. And so, to your point, I think that the fundamental importance of this autopsy and of any autopsy is not necessarily an ideological reflection, because it's difficult to forecast the ideology that will be that will be popular in 2028. That's that struck by lightning element that you can't account for. What are those 80,000 people in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania going to care about in November of 2028? We don't know. And so it's immaterial almost to perform an autopsy trying to answer that unanswerable question. What is important is we need an autopsy of our organization, of our competence to campaign. And that's where I agree with you, Rep.
Andrew?
I was just listening to you talk, and I remembered something kind of from near the beginning of the autopsy, and it went roughly along the lines of we can't really wait for like an Obama moment to happen again. And I think that's something they get right. Um, they've been kicked out to the wilderness. They are in what I would say are is going to be the next evolution of the Democratic Party. This is like the really formative years. They're in the egg right now developing. And come 2028, they might have something completely different than what we see because Americans have a short attention span. I mean, do we even keep up with the scandals that were happening back in 2022? I mean, I know we do because we're politically oriented, but the average Joe Schmo doesn't. In 2028, it's going to be a different environment. But I think, and this is just to sum it off, the Democrats, they're moving beyond Bill Clintonism, the new Democrat Party. They're moving towards something else. As to what that is, maybe we're getting little hints in mayoral elections in New York, but I don't know. And I don't think any of us can really know for sure. But I think what we can confidently say, or what I will confidently say, is that the Democrat Party of 2024, 2020, 2016, all the way back to 1992, it's on the way out. And something else is
Yeah.
coming in.
Yeah.
To what that is,
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the question that, the major ideological question that's animating the Democratic Party right now is, should we abandon radicalism or lean into it? Right? That's the question. And you have two different forces that are playing that out right now. And they're very, and the radicals that we're talking about are not well heeled, like not long tenured radicals. They're fairly new, right? And they're animated by questions that really frighten the establishment Democrats, right? And it's this document, as I read it and it was poorly and incompetently done. I think we all agree with that. But that it was attempting to make a very soft sell for the establishment perspective.
It's the last breath of
Right.
Schumer, I believe.
It's a soft sell for the don't lean into radicalism perspective. Jack, do you agree with that, or do you disagree with me here? Or maybe radicalism where it works, non-radicalism where it doesn't.
I agree with that to an extent. I think that you're attributing too much competence to the document in saying that it has a motivation or intention. I think that to Andrew's previous point, the document is so vague as to like it can be interpreted by anybody for their own benefit. I can sit here and say that the emphasis on local politics means that we should let Mamdani do what he wants to do in New York, or a centrist could sit here and say we need to have a messaging strategy that accommodates more American voices all the time. I think that it's too vague and imprecise to actually advance the interests of any one entity.
Yeah, and I mean,
But also, I don't know as much about Paul Rivera, the person, as you guys do. So I'm not as familiar with what might be
This
his.
did one
well,
shot.
it's just more than I did, Andrew. So good for you. But anyway, I mean, yeah, I think that this document, the recriminations seem to broadly be coming from the more insurgent wing of the party, and and certainly the attempt to get rid of Martin is coming from that wing of the party.
I I mean, I think it's. I don't think that that has to do with what's in the document so much as what's not in the document. I mean, it doesn't matter like what report the DNC released, short of it saying short of it like straight up arguing for um the nationalization of industries and the execution of Chuck Schumer. The left was always going to find issue with what was in this document. um and so I think that it's just a convenient cudgel.
I fully agree with that. I'm not. This is a tool. This has now become a political tool, right?
Mhm.
And which I mean, is too bad for the Democrats. But it's not really a surprise, I guess, in 2026. All right, gentlemen, it is the long weekend coming up, and although we are not necessarily Democratic staffers, I still feel like I can give you the time off. So enjoy the Memorial Day long weekend.
Yeah.
We're doing
Yeah,
more work
exactly.
than them.
Yep.
Well, you
We're doing more
Googled who the
work
guy
than
was. I
we
guarantee you
deserve.
most of these Democrats didn't. All right.
Wikipedia
Yeah, it
screw
is, right?
news.
All right. Okay, guys. Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a good long weekend.
Take care.
Y'all have a good one.